All right, guys, welcome to Economics and the Constitution. This is the 7th lecture in the series, the In the Constitution series that I do. So glad you're here. We're going to talk about some things that I think are important. I don't think there's any real doubt or any dispute about the state of our economy. It's in the tanks, right? And we have some big challenges ahead of us. What we're going to try to do is discover today, like we do in all the other presentations, what does the Constitution have to say about this topic? Because the Constitution, as I claim, has the answers. They're there. We don't need to look other places. We need to look to the Constitution and follow it. And that's how we're going to get the answers to get our economy back on track. So let's start out with a good quote here. I think it's a funny one. It's said in jest, obviously, but it's actually quite accurate. Ronald Reagan says, government's view of the economy could be summed up in a few short phrases. If it moves, tax it. If it keeps moving, regulate it. And if it stops moving, subsidize it. Okay, obviously that's said as a joke, but it's actually very, very true. That's how government views the economy, don't they? We need to get involved somehow, a way or another. If it's not working, or if it is working, we've got to inject ourselves into the economy. And that's the problem, isn't it? There's a famous economist named Thomas Sowell. This guy's really good. He says this: the first lesson of economics is scarcity. Okay, there's never enough of anything to satisfy all those who want it. That's the idea, right? If there are abundance of resources, you won't have to worry about it, but there's scarcity. That's the first lesson of economics. And he follows that up saying, the first lesson of politics is to disregard the first lesson of economics. Politicians say, look, you just give me enough power, enough rules, enough regulations, I can make it so there's no longer scarce resources. Well, the fact of the matter is, in economics, there is a scarcity of resources. That's an economic fact. That's a natural law fact. And so politicians, it's funny how he says that the first lesson of politics is to disregard the first lesson of economics, which obviously can't be done. So let's start out. I like to start the presentation with some definitions. The first definition is, what's economics in the first place? The standard textbook definition is the management of the scarce resources of an organized system in order to maximize benefits. Okay? It pretty much encompasses what economics is all about. You're managing scarce resources and for the purpose of maximizing your benefits, using those resources as efficiently as possible. Okay, the next definition to get clear in our heads is, what is wealth? What's wealth? It's a really interesting question, isn't it? When it comes down to, I think one way to look at this, it's kind of a different way of looking at it, is wealth equals productivity. That's what wealth is. Wealth is being productive. Okay, because the result of productivity is wealth. Now, a lot of people say wealth is simply a stack of paper currency. Is that true? No, we just learned about in our previous presentation, money in the Constitution, that a stack of paper currency is simply a stack of paper, isn't it? Okay? So wealth is not a stack of paper currency. Wealth is productivity. Now, piggybacking on that idea that wealth is productivity, let's look at this slide. In and of itself, the question is, does government produce anything, right? If wealth is productivity, does government produce anything in and of itself? No, they don't produce a single thing. All they do is redistribute the wealth of those citizens and people who are part of the government, okay, who pay taxes to the government. They don't produce anything in and of themselves. So if the answer to that question is no, then the follow-up is, therefore, can government create wealth? No, they don't produce anything, so they can't create wealth. All they do is use the wealth of their citizens to provide goods and services that hopefully, theoretically nowadays, is simply to protect those citizens, to protect their rights. Okay? But government doesn't produce anything, therefore government can't produce wealth. And that's the folly at the very basic level of very many ideas and governmental agencies is, oh, we can produce wealth. We can manage the economy. Government doesn't manage the economy. Government doesn't produce wealth. Okay? That's not their job. Okay, now the third term we're going to discuss is capital. What's capital? That's a term that's used a lot in economics classes, okay? Capital is the means of production. It's the means to produce wealth. Okay? Your labor, your natural resources, your land, your property, your equipment, that's what capital is. It's the means to produce the wealth, okay? It's the way that you make wealth. Now, if capital is the means to produce and to create wealth, then all systems are based on capitalism. You can't produce anything without capital, can you? You have to have land or labor or resources to do so. So all systems, all economic systems are capitalistic in nature because they have to have capital. They have to have the resources in order to do that. The difference between economic systems such as the free market, socialism, and communism lies in ownership of the capital. Decisions about what to produce, how much, and at what price are different in each economic system. In the free market, private individuals make that choice. In socialism and communism, the state and the government make those choices. And that's the big difference, is the ownership of that capital. Who makes those decisions? Okay? So that's capital. Now, summing it up in just one concise statement, I don't know if you've heard of Ludwig von Mises. Have you heard of Austrian economics? That's kind of a new word that's come out lately. Austrian economics. The founder of Austrian economics is this man named Ludwig von Mises. Great economist and understands things. Here's what he said, and I think it's probably the best definition there is about economics. Economics is not about goods and services. It's about human choice and action. That's what it's about. Economics is about a free market where people produce and meet the needs and wants of the citizenry and therefore succeed in economies, or those who don't and don't make it, right? It's about people being free to choose what they want. And that's why government interference in that choice is a problem, and that's what stifles our economy instead of does what it proposes to do, which is stimulate the economy. They can't stimulate the economy. Then get out of the way, and then the people themselves stimulate the economy because they're free. Because economics is not about goods and services, it's about human choice and action. Okay? All right, so what we're going to do now, we're going to get into 6 principles of economic freedom. Okay? And when I was thinking about this presentation, getting ready to get it together here today, I thought, it's a very quote-heavy presentation. There's a lot of quotes in this. And we get into the Constitution, we hit probably 5 or 6 clauses, but not nearly as many as we do in the other presentations. But I think my thought on this is if we can get into the minds and the hearts of our founders and understand what they thought about economics, what they thought about the proper role of government in the economy, then we can understand, okay, how do we impose that or transpose that onto the Constitution and see what these different clauses they had, why they wrote them that way, okay? So anyway, there's a lot of quotes. Be ready, but it's fun. There's a lot of good quotes. The first one I think is very good by Thomas Jefferson. It's very much an underlying foundational quote. The policy of the American government is to leave their citizens free, neither restraining nor aiding them in their pursuits. That is the essence of government involvement in the economy. Stay out of the way. Don't aid them. Don't restrain them. The proper role of government is to protect our rights, and has very little to do with the economy. The economy will be run by people who are free. Okay? Next quote by Thomas Jefferson again. He says, in political economy, I think Smith's Wealth of Nations is the best book. What are we talking about? Smith's Wealth of Nations. Does Adam Smith ring a bell? Okay, he wrote a book called Wealth of Nations, a huge, great, comprehensive book. Now, a lot of the things that were written in Wealth of Nations weren't original ideas. Some of them were. But to pull those all together into one comprehensive book was, yes, very much a revolutionary idea. Okay? So what is this Smith's Wealth of Nations? What did he say in the Wealth of Nations? Apparently Jefferson had read it, right? And he said, hey, I like this book. It's the best book out there to teach us about political economy. So what did Adam Smith propose? There's 5 principal things that he proposed, okay? The first thing he proposed is specialization of production. If you're good at raising corn, you're good at raising hogs, and I'm good at building houses, why don't we just focus on that and do our very best at that? There's some real economies gained there, right? Economization that's gained because I'm good at it. I don't have to spend my time changing and raising corn or changing and raising pigs. What if we all just do our very best at our own single specialization and then we engage in trade, right? And if you're more efficient with your resources, what does that mean? You're more productive. And if you're more productive, that means you're more wealthy. Okay, so the Wealth of Nations, that's the title of his book, you can get more wealthy by having specialization of production. Okay? Secondly, he argued for and established this idea of supply and demand. Okay? Supply and demand is a pretty simple economic principle. When there's a demand for something, the market supplies that. If there's not a demand, then the market won't supply that. Or if there's a surplus, there's too much supply and no demand, they'll end up selling it for a lower and lower price, etc. So supply and demand brings us to the next point. The next point is price tells the market what to produce and how much. Pretty simple idea, right? If there's a price point, the market determines that. No one sets that. The market determines it. If something's very popular, what's going to happen to the price? It's going to go up. If something's not popular, what's it going to do? It's going to go down. Okay? And it's all determined by free individuals who say you're meeting my needs or you're not meeting my needs. Price determines that. All right, so moving on to the fourth point. Competition keeps prices low and quality high. Okay, it's just a simple example. Okay, I'm making a killing on leather boots. I'm selling for $100 a piece to everyone, and it only costs me like $50 to produce them. I'm just making a killing. What's going to happen? Well, because they're popular, I'm making a good price, I'm going to have competition, aren't I? Someone else is going to come in and say, I can make those same boots for $90, and what's going to happen to all my market share? It's gone. Everyone's going to buy their boots, okay? Assuming you have the same quality. But he's selling them for 90, I'm going to say, well, I'm going to sell them for 80. Then my competitor says, well, I'm going to sell them for 60. And I say, well, I'm going to sell them for 55. That's about as low as the price can go. The whole time, though, what else are we competing on? We're competing on quality. We're gonna not only say these aren't the same boots, mine are better boots, mine are higher quality for a lower price. And what happens to the market? Competition makes the market produce higher quality and lower priced goods. That's the essence, that's the definition of economics, right? Using your resources more efficiently and creating that wealth with the same resources. Competition is what does that. It's what keeps the price low and the quality high. Lastly, profits and losses motivate economic decisions. If that weren't the case, if the government's safety net was so high that you felt it lifting on you all the time, then what would I do? If I knew that, gosh, no matter what happens, any losses I have will be recovered, they'll be bailed out by the government, what am I going to do? I'm going to make stupid decisions. I'm going to do whatever I feel like doing that's wrong. A bad idea. Don't do that. But I'm going to say, well, it doesn't matter if I do it, because if I fail, they're going to pick me up. Okay? What about profits? What if there are no profits? Why wake up in the morning? What's the point? Okay, government's just going to take care of me anyway. Why even wake up? Why go out to work? Why struggle? Why get a sunburn? And why stress my muscles? Why not just chill and relax? Profits and losses motivate economic behavior. Okay? And that's important to understand that. And who governs that? The free market does. People, individuals make those choices on an individual basis. The government doesn't manage that. When the government tries to, and they try to make a command economy, you get socialism and you get communism. You get something that falls apart because it doesn't work. No system is smart enough to manage all those. Only people themselves get to choose for themselves. That's what freedom's all about. Okay? So that's what his Wealth of Nations book, that's why Jefferson called it the best book existent at the time. Some good principles there. One other quote by Frederick Bastiat. If you haven't read Frederick Bastiat and The Law, it's an incredible book. I highly recommend it. Here's what he said. I love how he says, "A socialism, like the ancient ideas from which it springs, confuses the distinction between government and society. As a result of this, every time we object to a thing being done by government, the socialists conclude that we object to it being done at all." Okay? We disapprove of state education. Then the socialists say that we're opposed to any education. We object to a state religion. Then the socialists say that we want no religion at all. We object to a state-enforced equality. Then they say that we are against equality, and so on, and so on. It is as if the socialists were to accuse us of not wanting persons to eat because we do not want the state to raise grain. Well stated, right? Pretty interesting. Wait a second. Who's supposed to do all this stuff? What we're saying is socialists would say the government needs to provide this. Freedom lovers say, no, the government needs to get out of the way and let us provide it for ourselves. That's the essence of economic freedom. Okay, so that's principle number one, that the free market forces should control the economy, the government should not. Principle number two is the right to own and control property. And I have to tell you beforehand, I have a whole presentation called Property Rights in the Constitution. So we're going to touch this lightly because there's at least an hour and a half of information on property rights that we'll get later on. The classic quote by this is John Adams. He says this: "The moment the idea is admitted into society that property is not as sacred as the laws of God, and that there is not a force of law and public justice to protect it, anarchy and tyranny commence. Property must be secured, or liberty cannot exist." Why is that? Because property is an extension of who I am. Okay, it's the result of what I do. My property is, in essence, my life and my liberty. That's what it is. Okay? Madison puts it this way: property in its particular application means, quote, "that dominion which one man claims and exercises over the external things of the world in exclusion of every other individual, and which leaves to everyone else the like advantage." Property means it's mine. I can do what I want to with it. It doesn't mean no one else can't do what they want to do with their own property, but it means my property is my property. It excludes other people's right to control my property. It's mine. That's the whole point. Okay? He has an equal property in the free use of his faculties and free choice of the objects on which to employ them. If it's your property, you get to do with your property whatever you'd like to do. That's the whole point, isn't it? Okay? It's simple. That's the essence of private property. And that's how freedom and wealth are created, because I have control over my property and no one else tells me what I can and can't do. As long as what? As long as I'm not infringing on someone else's rights through the use of my property or through my actions. Otherwise, I'm free to do what I'd like to do. Okay? Washington puts it succinctly: private property and freedom are inseparable. Okay? It's that simple. Private property and freedom are inseparable. You think about the nations of the earth, where there is not private property, or there's very reduced ability to control and use your property and own your property. What happens? Economic extinction, essentially, right? You look at all these third world countries, that's why, because they don't have private property. They can't do with their property what they want to do. Government does it for them, or they may own it, but government tells them what they'll do with it. Okay? That's not good. Principle number 3, the right to keep the fruit of one's labors. Samuel Adams has a quote here that almost sounds current. It almost sounds like a modern day quote. Because you understand, when you start to listen to these founders, you say, these guys understand true principles. Okay? Yes, they're farmers. Yes, they're agrarian. But was the Constitution written on farming principles, or was it written on freedom principles? Okay? Look what he says. He says, the utopian schemes of leveling. Okay, what's leveling? It's the redistribution of wealth. He who has, give to he who has not. The redistribution of wealth. It's a utopian scheme. It's some altruistic idea. That utopian scheme, and a community of goods, which is simply everyone owns the goods, which means nobody owns the goods, right? He says those two schemes are as visionary and impracticable, you can't practice them, they don't work, as those which vest all property in the crown. These ideas are arbitrary, despotic, and in our government, unconstitutional. I like that quote because he's saying these are bad ideas, these are dumb ideas, these are incorrect ideas, but we not only recognize those as bad, we have established in our Constitution that those things will not be lawful in our country. That's cool. It gets you excited. Hey, so these things they're talking about, they show up as principles in the Constitution. Okay? Jefferson also said this, I predict future happiness. Talk about a current quote, right? I predict future happiness for Americans if they can prevent the government from wasting the labors of the people under the pretense of taking care of them. Okay, another quote by Jefferson. You can tell he's one of my favorite authors or favorite thinkers. He said this, to compel a man to furnish contributions of money for the propagation of opinions which he disbelieves and abhors is sinful and tyrannical. Anyone in this room being forced to give their money towards ideas they don't agree on? Every one of us, right? Yes, that's the problem. We're being forced to support these ideas that we don't even hold true. Okay? When we talk about welfare or abortion or Planned Parenthood, all of our money is going towards that. Okay? He calls that sinful and tyrannical. He says the government is overstepping its bounds. It's not just protecting people, it's forcing people to do things they wouldn't otherwise do on their own. Okay? So principle number 4, personal responsibility. Don't do for someone what he can and should do for himself. Okay, this is the 4th principle. This is very good. I don't know, I get excited about these quotes. This is a really cool quote by Franklin. Franklin says this, I am for doing good to the poor, but I differ in opinion of the means. I think the best way of doing good to the poor is not making them easy in poverty, but leading or driving them out of it. I observed in different countries, and remember, Franklin traveled more than anyone in the world at that point, okay? I observed in different countries that the more public provisions are made for the poor, the less they provided for themselves. And, of course, became poor. And on the contrary, the less was done for them, the more they did for themselves and became richer. It makes sense, doesn't it? Drive them out of poverty. Don't make their life easy in poverty, then they'll continue to just take it and take whatever the government gives them. Make it so they have an incentive to improve and get out of that situation. He goes on to say this, to relieve the misfortunes of our fellow creatures is concurring with deity. It's godlike to help the poor. Oh, that's what he said. It's godlike. But if we provide encouragement for laziness and supports for folly, may we not be found fighting against the order of God and nature, which perhaps has appointed want and misery as the proper punishments for, and cautions against, as well as necessary consequences of, idleness and extravagance. Whenever we attempt to amend the scheme of providence, we had need be very circumspect, lest we do more harm than good. Wouldn't you like to read that to our current administration and Congress? Say, look, be very circumspect. You're doing more harm than you are good. Why? Because you may be getting in the way of natural laws, of natural justice. Okay? And the government's job isn't to do that. The government's job is to protect our rights, not ensure that nothing bad ever happens, because sometimes bad things happen. When you make bad choices, what happens? You have bad consequences. That's what I tell my kids all the time, right? It's that simple. When government gets in there, oh, we're not going to let you get hurt. We're not going to let you skin your knee. Well, if you jump off the cliff, the government can't stop that, right? There has to be some natural consequences. Okay? Madison says this. So this is in regards to helping the poor, right? And not doing for someone what they should do for themselves. Madison says, I cannot undertake to lay my finger on that article of the Constitution which granted a right to Congress of expending on objects of benevolence the money of their constituents. Here's James Madison, the father of the Constitution. He says, you show me where. You point in the Constitution where it says that Congress has the authorization to spend their constituents' money for the poor to help other people. It's not in there. That's what he says, okay? President Franklin Pierce says the same thing in a different way. I cannot find any authority in the Constitution for public charity. It would be contrary to the letter and the spirit of the Constitution and subversive to the whole theory upon which the Union of these States is founded. What is the theory upon which the Union of the States is founded? Isn't it on personal responsibility? Isn't that what it's all about? Isn't that what the American dream is? Is I can do whatever I want to. The sky's the limit. I can accomplish whatever I want to accomplish. It subverts that. It destroys that philosophy by saying, oh, we're just going to hand out money from someone to someone else and just transfer this wealth and redistribute wealth That's wrong, okay? Now, the question then becomes, if we had been living, let's assume we haven't, I think we all agree, we haven't been living constitutional principles for quite a while now. Let's say we had, for the last 226 years, we had been following the Constitution. Would there still be poor people among us? Sure, there'll still be poor people. So how do you solve that? What do you do? How do you resolve that issue? Well, here's how you resolve it, okay? There's an interesting historical event. Grover Cleveland, in 1887, there's a very, very popular bill. It came from the Senate and the House and passed easily and came to his desk. And it was a public charity bill. It was to relieve the misfortune of the poor, right? And he vetoed it. And it was interesting that he actually took an advertisement out in a New York newspaper to explain to the American public why he vetoed it. He wanted to teach them true principles. And here's what he said. The friendliness and charity of our countrymen can always be relied upon to relieve their fellow citizen in misfortune. So who's going to take care of the poor that will exist among us? Their fellow men, their neighbors, right? Okay? You can always count on them to do so. Federal aid in such cases encourages the expectation of paternal care on the part of the government and weakens the sturdiness of our national character. Something bad happened to me, I need to look to Daddy. And who's Daddy? Daddy is the government. That weakens our national character. How does that weaken our national character? Because it turns me into a good law-abiding citizen, but not into a good neighbor. My neighbor's suffering. Oh, they got food stamps. They're fine. My neighbor has some challenges. Oh, well, there's some program. There's an agent. I think there's a federal agent that goes to their house every day and fixes that. And we say, it's not my problem. And it turns us into good, stoic citizens and not good neighbors. Okay? That's essentially what he's saying. While it prevents the indulgence among our people of the kindly sentiment and conduct which strengthens the bonds of a common brotherhood. If we let government do for us what we should be doing for ourselves and for our neighbors, then it puts government in an unnatural state. It's not their state to do that. They don't have resources. Remember, they don't produce wealth. All they can do is take someone else's wealth. Well, then why don't I choose to do that? If I choose to do that, and guess what? It's an act of charity. If I'm forced to do it, it's no longer an act of charity. I resist that. I don't want someone taking my stuff. I'd be glad to help my neighbor, but I don't want the government taking it from me and forcing me to give it to them. It's a whole different story. Okay? Principle number 5 here is government involvement in the economy should be non-intrusive, impartial, predictable, and in accordance with natural law. Okay? Frederick Bastiat, once again going to him, here's how he puts it. Life, liberty, property, this is man. And in spite of the cunning of artful political leaders, these 3 gifts from God precede all human legislation and are superior to it. Okay? So the natural law says that life, liberty, and property, it comes as a gift from God, not through legislation. And legislation, therefore, can't impede upon or infringe upon our life, liberty, and property. It's important to understand that. Now, Bastiat said there's some natural laws. He had another name for laws that were unnatural, that were against true principles of freedom, and he called those legalized plunder. He's pretty famous for this idea that he's developed in his book. He says this, how is this legal plunder to be identified? Quite simply, see if government takes from some persons what belongs to them and gives it to other persons to whom it does not belong. Okay? That's what legalized plunder is. When the government makes it lawful for them, the government, to take from one and give to another. See if government benefits one citizen at the expense of another by doing what the citizen himself cannot do without committing a crime. Okay? He puts it pretty straightforward, doesn't he? That's exactly what's happening in our economy today. We're taking from some and giving to others. And if I were to do that, if I were to take from you and give to you, I get thrown in jail. But the government says, no, we can do whatever we want to do, and they break the very principle they're supposed to stand to protect. Okay? Now, number 6, our last principle, don't spend more than you earn. Franklin, who's always kind of witty, he says this, spend less than you earn, happy. Spend more than you earn, unhappy. Pretty simple, right? Okay? Jefferson, the principle of spending money to be paid by posterity in the name of funding is but swindling futurity on a large scale. Is that today? You better believe that is as current as it gets. Spending money, they call it kicking the can down the road. They say, oh, our grandchildren will pay for it. That is swindling futurity. That's swindling our grandchildren on a large scale. And that's exactly what's happening today, okay? Because what's happening? Because we're spending more than we earn. Why is government doing that? Because in general, government represents the people. And in general, the people themselves spend more than they earn. So why would we expect anything different from our elected officials than we don't expect of ourselves? Okay? So we need to do that. We need to practice that as well. Okay. So those are 6 principles of freedom. Now what we're going to do is we're going to ask a few more questions, okay? Is there a proper role for government in the economy? I've talked over and over, the government shouldn't be involved in the economy. It shouldn't be there, it shouldn't do this, it shouldn't do that. Is there a proper role for government in the economy, though? There is, okay? Madison put it this way: persons and property are the two great subjects on which governments are to act. The rights of persons and the rights of property are the objects for the protection of which government was instituted. Government exists to protect people and their property. Okay? And is even more succinctly said in the Declaration says that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. That is the purpose of government, is to secure the rights of men. Period. Okay, so there's a proper role, and the proper role for government in the economy is to protect. Okay? Protect men's rights. So the Constitution requires government to enact and enforce laws that protect the free market forces as the means for controlling our economy, that protect the right of man to own and control property, that protect the right of man to keep the fruit of his labors, laws that protect the natural law of personal responsibility, to enact and enforce laws that protect man from intrusive, partial, unpredictable governmental involvement, and that protect man from the enslavement of unpaid public debt. Those 6 points ring a bell? Those are the 6 principles we just discussed, aren't they? So the role in each one of those principles, the single role of the government is to protect the rights of men in reflection or relation to those 6 principles. Okay? It's a very great proper role of government. It is to protect the rights of men so they can act freely in the economy and do what they think is best. Now, since we just said here the Constitution requires government to enact and enforce laws that do these things, be a perfect segue to talk about the Constitution now. Where are those laws? How do those laws show up? Not just in principles, not just in quotes from the Founding Fathers, but how do they actually show up in the actual words of the Constitution? But before I go there, I'm tempted to just show you this other slide. Let me just show you the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto so we can do a contrast between how it should be and what's actually happening. Okay? And as we read through these, if you start to say, now wait a second, that's happening, oh, that's happening, don't be surprised, okay? You may end up saying all 10 are alive and well. Number 1, abolition of private property, all land for public purposes. Okay? Number 2, a heavy progressive or graduated income tax, i.e. the 16th Amendment. Abolition of all rights of inheritance. Nowadays they say that inheritance tax is over 50%. You better not inherit something from someone, you'll end up losing the farm over it, right? Number 4, confiscation of the property of all immigrants and rebels. And who defines who the rebels are? Well, the communists do, right? It's their manifesto. Rebels are those who rebel against communism. Number 5, centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and exclusive monopoly, i.e. the Federal Reserve. Okay? Number 6, centralization of the means of communication and transport, the FCC, DOT, factories and instruments of production owned by the state, state-controlled industrial and agricultural armies, combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries, and number 10, free education for all children in public schools. Okay? You start to see the juxtaposition there, the contrast between what the Constitution calls for, what these principles of freedom call for, and what the Communist Manifesto calls for, the exact opposite. But the scary part is that what the Communist Manifesto calls for is very much alive and well today. That's the scary part. Okay? So now let's get into the Constitution. First, I'm going to start with a quote by Patrick Henry. It says, "The Constitution is not an instrument for the government to restrain the people. It's an instrument for the people to restrain the government, lest it come to dominate our lives and interests." Anyone here feel like the government is dominating their lives and interests? We were just having a conversation a little while ago with some friends saying, I can't even drink raw milk at my friend's house because that's against the law. I can't do that. Wait, they're coming to dominate our lives and interests, aren't they? It's not their job. Okay, so now we're getting to my favorite part, okay, the part where we actually talk about what's in the Constitution. What does the Constitution itself have to say about the economy? The first amendment that came to mind for me was Amendment 5 and 14. They're both written the same way in this particular part, and it says, "No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law." You remember the previous quote we had of John Adams where he said that property must be secured or liberty cannot exist. Therefore, if you take from someone their property, you take from them their liberty. Okay? And the due process clause says you can't do that. The government can't take from people their life, liberty, or property unless, and there is a stipulation there, unless what? They have due process of law. In other words, unless they infringe on the rights of someone else's life, liberty, and property. If that happens, the government's proper role is to infringe on someone's life, liberty, or property, to throw them in jail, to restrict their liberty, to fine them, to take from them their property, etc., because they have violated someone else's rights. Okay? So due process of law allows for government to act on people's life, liberty, or property, but only if they've had their day in court and been able to defend themselves and able to say, here's what my case is. If they're found guilty, then yes, there should be some action on them. and it's proper for government to act on them in their role of protecting other citizens in their rights. Okay? The next 14th Amendment is the Equal Protection Clause. It says, "Nor shall any state deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws." Now think about how this applies to the economy. Okay? If someone's not sure that the fruit of their labor is going to be taken from them, that they might randomly get punished or might randomly get regulated or told you will do this or won't do that, then are they going to take the risk of getting involved in the economy, of building or of hiring or of starting a business? No. The economy will grind to a halt. It needs to flourish because it knows that government's going to stand there and give equal protection to all citizens. Okay, equal protection under the law is very important. And this is the essence of the role of government, isn't it? Is to provide equal protection of the laws. Now, I want to point out the word protection, okay? It's equal rights, not equal things. Notice it's protection, it's not equal benefits. Rights are the ability to do things, not to receive things. If you have a right, it means you're free to do it, not means you're free to receive it. There's the natural law of the harvest, right? You have to do and then you receive. It doesn't mean, the government guarantees me in the Equal Protection Clause that they're going to give me things. And it's only fair because I am this or that different class than someone else, and therefore I need to be equally given things. No, you have equal protection. Everyone's free under the law to do what they want to do, as long as they don't infringe on someone else's rights. Okay? Equal rights, not equal things. Okay, there's the first two clauses that I think apply directly to the economy. Thirdly, the Contracts Clause, Article 1, Section 10, Clause 1. Here's what it says. "No state shall pass any ex post facto law or law impairing the obligation of contracts." Okay? Now, when it comes to contracts, what are contracts? Contracts is essentially commerce. It's essentially the economy. People enter into different agreements. I'll give you this if you give me that. I'll pay you that if you give me this. I'll exchange my labor if you pay me this wage. That's what contracts are. And very, very clear in the Contracts Clause, the government's job is to get out of the way. They're not supposed to set the terms of the contract. They're there to ensure the terms of the contract are fulfilled in order to protect the rights of the two parties entering into the contract. Okay? Let's break this down. Let's look at this law impairing the obligation to contracts. So two ways to look at contracting, okay? The freedom to contract means that you should be able to be free to contract with whomever you want under whatever condition you like to. It's your choice, right? And it's their choice. As long as you two are good with it, the government can't come in and say you can't do that. Well, yes, we can. We're fine with it. We don't have to make sure you like it. We like it. We're fine. We don't need you to protect us from ourselves. Okay? But the freedom from contract means that you can't be made a party to a contract without your consent. They can't make you be part of a contract. Okay? That would violate your right to self-governance. So no contract would be binding on you if you didn't choose to sign it or choose to enter it. Just the government said you have to do this. That's the Contracts Clause. It's very, very small, right? It's like 2 sentences here, or half a sentence. It's very, very important to understand what that means, though. You start to apply that and say, oh, yeah, government's job is not to make the terms. Government's job is to enforce the terms. It's my job as a private citizen to enter into the contract. Let's go to the next line here, the ex post facto. What's ex post facto mean? Ex post facto means after the fact, okay? Now, if the government makes a law or a ruling that overrides a previous contract, that would be an ex post facto law. Do they ever do that these days? You bet. Have you heard of bailouts? Have you heard of short sales? Have you heard all these different rules and regulations they have? Oh, you can do that. It's legal. Well, if you haven't learned this already, it's high time you know. Just because something's legal doesn't mean it's moral, does it? Doesn't mean it's right just because something's legal. Many, many times the government will write and enter into ex post facto law after the fact, making something legal that wasn't legal beforehand. So to make the point clearer, the danger with ex post facto law is that it can go retroactively back and make something illegal that was previously legal, or vice versa. That's the problem with ex post facto law. It's an unnatural idea, and that's why the founders said, no, we're not going to do ex post facto law. It's trying to redo what's already been done through contract. Okay? Now, the real world we live in, people enter into contracts, and sometimes people can't fulfill their end of the contract, right? Now, don't tell me the founders actually had a provision in the Constitution for that, too. Well, they did, okay? They have a provision in the Constitution about bankruptcy. So in the Bankruptcy Clause, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 4, it says this: Congress shall have power to establish uniform laws on the subject of bankruptcies throughout the United States. Now, nowadays, we've all been conditioned to think that bankruptcy, what that means is, oh, poor debtor, right? That's what bankruptcy is all about. It's the poor debtor, isn't it? But the reason, if you look historically, the reason the founders put bankruptcy law into the Constitution in the first place wasn't to help the poor debtor. It was to help the poor creditor. Because who's getting hosed in the contract? When the creditor gives and the debtor can't give back, who's the one who's poor and getting hosed? It's the creditor, right? Bankruptcy is there to help the creditor, to make sure the creditor is taken care of. Let me explain this a little bit further. The key word in this is a uniform law of bankruptcy. Because what happened before, in the Articles of Confederation, each state was able to set their own bankruptcy laws. Okay? There's an infamous state, Rhode Island. They called it Rogue Island because what happened is that their bankruptcy laws were so pro-debtor that everyone would always move their bankruptcy claims and their property into that state and then say, okay, yeah, let's go to court in bankruptcy court. And the laws are very pro-debtor and they can get off like bandits, right? So everyone started just moving their property and moving their claims to more debtor-loving and debtor-helping states. And so the founders said, we can't have that happen. We can't have it between states because then people will get taken advantage of, okay? Madison put it this way. The power of establishing, this is in the Federalist 42, the power of establishing uniform laws of bankruptcy will prevent so many frauds where the parties or their property may lie or be removed into different states. See, that's why they're trying to do this. That's why they make sure, let's make it a uniform law. Let's make it so Congress is in charge of setting a uniform law of bankruptcy, okay? So that way the rights of the people involved in the contracts will be as protected as possible and not be defrauded simply by moving to a state that's more debtor-friendly. All right, to finish up bankruptcy, there's a quote, there's a gem I found, okay? Get ready for this. You're going to have to hold your sides, okay? This is from a bankruptcy lawyer's website in Chicago. Surprised anybody? Okay, bankruptcy should no longer be thought of as a last resort. In fact, the sooner bankruptcy is considered a viable option, the sooner the debtor can regain his or her dignity and become a more productive member of society, helping the economy recover. There's no question that bankruptcy should be considered patriotic. Okay? So wait a second. Look at our world is turned upside down, hasn't it? Bankruptcy is supposed to be to protect the creditor and help the creditor who is really the one losing out in this contractual obligation. And we've all been trained and indoctrinated to the point where someone can actually put this on the website and not get laughed out of town. It's patriotic. It helps the economy. Really? Last time I checked, it didn't. Okay? Now, this is a huge contrast. I think this is a little part of the Constitution that I had never really thought about before. I saw it and I thought, boy, I've got to put this in the presentation. Article 6, Clause 1. Very, very interesting. This says, all debts contracted and engagements entered into before the adoption of the Constitution shall be as valid against the United States under this Constitution as under the Confederation. Do you know what's happened throughout history? Whenever a nation changes government, they always write off their debts. Say, sorry, that was the old government that owed you $1 million. We're not paying for it. What did the men of integrity of our country, our God-fearing founders, what did they say? If we owed you under the Articles of Confederation, we owe you under the Constitution. And there were some men who died in debtor's prison who were very rich and gave all they had. They literally did sacrifice their lives and fortune. Never their sacred honor, though. Okay, they sacrificed their fortune to pay back Tories who were helping the British in the Revolutionary War, to pay debts to suppliers, etc., that any other person would say, well, I'm not going to pay for that. Come on. That was war and just deal with it. Write that debt off. And not these men. They had such virtue that they actually wrote it in the Constitution. We will honor our debts. Isn't that beautiful? It's a powerful idea, a powerful statement of the founders to put it in black and white writing and make it part of our constitutional law of the land. We will pay our debts, period. Okay? Now, we can't talk about economics in the Constitution without hitting the Interstate Commerce Clause. This is a big one. We've talked about this 2 or 3 different times in 2 or 3 different presentations. I'll try to go in a little more depth or at least a little different angle with this Interstate Commerce Clause. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 says, the Congress shall have power to regulate commerce among the several states. Okay? Now, the key word there's a couple of them. One I'd like to point out is among the several states. In other words, if we're talking about jurisdiction here, among means interstate commerce, the commerce between the states, okay, among the states. Notice it doesn't say within the states because that would be intrastate commerce. Congress is only in charge of the interstate, the commerce that happens between the states, not the commerce that happens inside the states. That's a huge, important distinction to understand there. The second one is this word regulate. What's it mean to regulate? It means to keep regular, to keep flowing, to keep happening. You understand the historical context behind the Interstate Commerce Clause? What happened is there's states who are beating each other up, who are treating each other like foreign nations and putting duties and imposts and taxes on all the commerce that came from other states. And North Carolina said, well, if you want to go across our property, Virginia, we're going to charge you 30% duties. And Virginia says, oh yeah, we're going to charge you 40%. And Maryland says, oh yeah, we're going to. And next thing you know, they're just destroying each other duties, and the commerce, the economy is coming to a screeching halt. Congress said, we can't have that happen. We can't have states setting their own terms of duties and imposts and taxes. We need to give that power to the Congress. And the power that Congress has is to disallow any duties and taxes, okay? So we can start acting like a nation. We can start acting like a productive economy instead of grinding ourselves into oblivion with our taxes, etc. Okay? This is reiterated, hopefully even clarified, in Article 1, Section 9, Clauses 5 through 6. Okay? It says this: no tax or duty shall be laid on articles exported from any state. Okay? Congress is going to disallow this export taxes and duties. No preference shall be given by any regulation of commerce or revenue to the ports of one state over those of another. What's that mean? Well, if you have Alexandria, Virginia, and you have Charleston, South Carolina, Congress isn't going to say to the world, hey guys, down in Charleston, we're only going to charge you 5%. But up in Alexandria, we're going to charge you 20%. Where's all the commerce going to go to? It's going to go to Charleston, right? They can't do that. They can't make a difference. As they put it, they can't have a preference be given by any regulation of commerce. It has to be the same. So there's not going to be some manipulation by the centralized Congress into where the commerce actually happens, where the economy can grow and flourish because they've chosen one port over another to give a grant of a special privilege. Lastly, nor shall vessels bound to or from one state be obliged to enter, clear, or pay duties in another. Okay? So in short, let me just, in my own terms, say what this means. Congress can't put duties or taxes on state goods. Congress will make no law that gives unfair advantage to any other state over another. And Congress will have the ability to disallow states to impose duties and taxes on each other so that commerce among the states can flourish. Okay? That's what it says. Let me give you a couple of quotes that may say that more clearly than I just did. Madison says this: it is very certain that the Commerce Clause is intended as a negative and preventive provision against injustice among the states themselves, rather than as a power to be used for the positive purposes of the general government. Okay? Saying what I just said. And James Monroe, this may be the clearest one. A power then to impose such duties and imposts in regard to foreign nations and to prevent any on the trade between the states was the only power granted. Okay? Interstate Commerce Clause is very, very clear. It's about the interstate commerce, and it's about Congress disallowing them to put duties on each other. It's that simple. And yet today, the Interstate Commerce Clause is the granddaddy of them all. It's bringing all kinds of oppression, all kinds of regulation, all kinds of craziness to our economy because government misunderstands, misinterprets, misrepresents what the Commerce Clause is all about. Okay, so those are the clauses that apply to economics in the Constitution. Okay, now we're going to get to one of my favorite quotes. This is a great, great quote. This should be a bumper sticker, but it would have to be like a car wrap, okay? This is a long, long quote. You cannot legislate the poor into freedom by legislating the wealthy out of freedom. What one person receives without working for, another person must work for without receiving. The government cannot give to anybody anything that the government does not first take from somebody else. When half of the people get the idea that they do not have to work because the other half is going to take care of them, and when the other half gets the idea it does no good to work because somebody else is going to get what they worked for, that, my dear friend, is about the end of any nation. And he concludes by saying, you cannot multiply wealth by dividing it. That's Dr. Adrian Rogers. A very good quote. That kind of is a synopsis of everything we've been talking about, isn't it? Okay? Now, we're going to spend some time ending the presentation talking about modern-day intrusion by the government into the economy. We're going to take those 6 principles and give specific examples of how those have been violated, how the clauses in the Constitution have been violated in our modern day, okay? So here's our 6 principles. The first one we're going to talk about is the free market, right? The free market should govern the economy, not the government. Okay, when you think of free market, you think of free trade, right? NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Congress is currently debating the TPP and the TTIP, okay? These different partnerships and agreements to help free trade. Well, what's an agreement that says free trade? It's pretty simple, isn't it? Free trade is like a 1-page document that says you're free to trade with us and we're free to trade with you. Why do we need 2,000 pages and 1,500 bureaucracies set up, international bodies to control that, right? So you look at free trade and you start to say, well, wait, what do they mean by free trade when they have all these? Now remember, we all know that European Union is completely falling apart, right? You know how the European Union started? It was simply a common market. It was simply a free trade agreement. It was called a common market. It was to help their economy. And what happened because of that? That tiny little seed has grown into this huge bureaucracy of control. The European Union no longer has sovereign countries. They're essentially bound to whatever the European Union wants them to do. Okay, that's one of the examples of free trade, the free market. I'm going to give you another more specific example. The Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae housing bubble burst. Okay, talk about a free market gone awry. It's too many people say, oh, what happened is the banks, those greedy banks got involved and they tried to manipulate the market and they took advantage of things. Well, they would have never had the opportunity to take advantage. I'm not saying they're not greedy, nor culpable in some amount, but they would have never had that opportunity had the government not inserted unnatural forces into the housing market, okay? Here's the short-term benefit. What happened is a lot of politicians said, hey, there's a good way to score some points here. It is the American dream that every family should be able to own a home. Home ownership is the American dream, and no one should be denied that. And we're looking at you banks, and you banks are not allowing enough minorities, poverty level people to get a job, get a loan, okay? And the bank said, well, yeah, that's right. We only let certain people, regardless of their race or nationality or socioeconomic status, regardless of religion, anything, they have to meet a certain financial standard or else we don't loan to them. And the government says, well, that's not right. And we can make political points on this. So we're going to make you do that. And I said, no, you're not going to make us. We're not going to loan our money out to people that aren't worthy of the loan. We know they can't pay it back. Government said, okay, well, what if we guarantee that loan? Bank said, sounds good. And what if they default on it and we'll pay you for it? Banks say, sweet, open the floodgates. Let's open this whole thing called subprime loans. Subprime means they're below the standard needed to in order to, they don't meet the standard to be loaned to. Okay? They don't have the financial credibility to be given money to. So they have subprime loans that are just going out the door. Banks love it. Every person is a potential loan receiver, okay? And they can make tons of money. That's how they make their money, is on loans. What happens when, lo and behold, a couple years later, those people who couldn't pay it on paper, it comes to bear and they really couldn't pay it? What happens? Well, this big bubble that was burst, or this big bubble that was pumped up with inflation, with a bunch of money pumped into the system, it popped. And everyone knew that was going to happen. It had to happen. These guys aren't creditworthy and they're getting money given to them, okay? And they couldn't pay it back, and so the bubble popped. Now, why did that happen? It's ridiculous, and it's actually maddening when people blame that on the free market. They say, oh, it's because of the free market, because of greed in the free market. That's why we have to have more regulation to regulate those greedy bankers and regulate those greedy people who are trying to make money off the market. That's not what happened. It's because government intervened and put unnatural forces in place and allowed the market to supply products that the market could not support. Okay? That's important to understand that, because too often it's easy for them to blame the free market. The free market just has to be regulated. We have proof. Look, the housing bubble burst. That's because of a bunch of greedy bankers and capitalism. It was not. It was because of the government. So going back to the slide real quick, the short-term benefit, it's the American dream that everyone should own a home. Well, what's the long-term consequence? The long-term consequence is Americans who can't afford homes default on their mortgages. Okay? All because government allowed them to. Incentivize the market to do something that was unnatural. Now, number 2, own and control property, okay? Federal and state public lands. Here's the example today, nowadays. This might blow your mind. Maybe you knew this, maybe you didn't. But if you didn't, you might start to have a heart attack here. The federal government claims to own 34% of our nation's total land area. They claim to own 34% of all of our land, the federal government. Even though, and maybe I'll foretell a little bit of my property rights presentation, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17 is very clear. The federal government can only own land for forts, arsenals, magazines, dockyards, and other needful buildings. What about national forests and national parks and all these different things? They're not legitimate federal lands, and yet they claim to own 34%. That's a third of our nation, okay? The federal government claims to own in Wyoming 48% of our land here. 48%, nearly half of our land, the federal government says we own, we control. You don't. Only we can manage it. Only we can own it. Really? Wyoming state government owns an additional 6% of land in Wyoming. So therefore, over 50% of the land in Wyoming is owned by the government. What happens to the productivity of that land when it's owned by government? It goes in the tubes, doesn't it? Because government doesn't have a natural incentive to protect it. It's not their land. What's government land? It's everyone's land, and therefore it's nobody's land. When it's private land, you own it. You care. You do what you need to do to take care of it. Lastly, don't forget, plank number 1 of the Communist Manifesto is what? Abolition of private property, all land for public purposes. Are we headed that direction? You bet. We're headed towards the first plank of Communist Manifesto. All land is for public purposes, because government knows best, right? Point number 3, keep the fruit of your labor. My example today, OSHA, EPA, Department of Labor, IRS, Department of Commerce, etc., with their fines, their standards, their minimum wage laws, their regulations, rules, policies, complicated tax codes, hiring procedures, not to mention labor unions that aren't just allowed, but in actually some states they're governmentally mandated they have unions, okay? Now, what are those things? They may say, you know what, we exist to protect, okay? We're here to protect people. That's why OSHA's here. That's why EPA is here. When in actuality, though, what they do is they exist to take the fruit of someone's labor and sustain themselves or redistribute it to others. Their job isn't, what they do in reality is not protect. What they do in reality is control, okay? Their policy suggests they exist to control and to take from the fruit of one's labor that which they have not produced themselves, period. There's a quote here by Brian Farmer. He's a writer in the New American Magazine. He says, regulation acts as a proxy for direct government ownership of the means of production. If government can regulate you and control you that way, even though they say, oh, you own it, you really don't, because they control what you do with it, don't you? That's a form of fascism. That's what fascism is. Well, you own it, but you can't do anything you want to. We tell you what you'll do with it. Okay? That's what's happening when these different agencies are set up to control our resources. Number 4, personal responsibility. I think some of the classic examples of that, food stamps, Medicare, Medicaid, farm subsidies, Social Security, welfare, subsidized loans, subsidized housing, etc. Now, it's really interesting. Those of us, in general, the people I associate with are in the middle class, okay? Middle class, those of us who are producers, we get really frustrated with the redistribution of wealth, because what are they doing? They're taking the fruit of my labor and they're giving it to somebody else. In the process, they're stealing from me, right? I think too often we fail to recognize and think about the damage it does to the people who receive something for nothing. What does it do to them? It tells them you are dependent. You cannot survive unless the government gives you something. You can't survive unless we take it from somebody else. And it teaches them that they can't have any pride in themselves and who they are. You have to sit back and be given something, and you can't be independent. Independent is free. You can't have freedom. It destroys their freedom as well. It takes from me my freedom because it takes from the fruit of my labors, but it takes from them their freedom because they now have to be dependent. It's a destructive circle, and it takes control over the giver and the receiver. Or not the giver, the person being extorted, and the receiver, okay? And it's been stated that 2/3 of the federal budget is spent on programs and agencies and entitlements that are not supported by the Constitution, that are involved in wealth redistribution. 2/3 of the federal budget is simply wealth redistribution, okay? Number 5, limited government. The classic example is the government bailouts, okay? What happened to the government bailouts? Well, they set some standards, didn't they? The point to be made with government bailouts is not government's role to pick winners and losers. The economy, the free market makes that choice. Very, very critical is the second point. Freedom to fail is just as important as freedom to succeed. If you can't fail, then you really can't succeed either, can you? It's all just one big sameness. If you want to have freedom to succeed, you have to have the freedom to fail. Not just be bailed out because, it didn't work out, I'm too big to fail. Too big to fail? How's that work? Okay? Was the bailout money used to rebuild and restructure for stability? That's an interesting thing to look into. I've done a little research on that. It was not used to rebuild and to restructure. It was used to take advantage of some of the smaller people in the industry and to build on their losses. I got money to rebuild and restructure. I'm going to use it to buy out my competitor, my small competitor. Wait a second. That's not what the bailout's for in the first place. It's not that it's good in the first place, but they're using the money that's supposed to restructure and rebuild them, and instead they did things they shouldn't have done, like we heard in the news. Gave multi-million-dollar bonuses to their executives, bought out smaller companies. Wait. Now, and don't forget, when the government bails them out, what does that mean? Who bailed them out? You and I bailed them out. The government doesn't produce wealth, remember? We do. We bailed them out. I mean, so there's this company that was so big it was too big to fail, and I was forced to bail them out for bad and irresponsible decisions? That doesn't make sense. That's a violation of my rights, okay? Stealing my property from me to give it to them because they misused and wasted theirs. Lastly, what precedent has now been set? The precedent is, don't worry, you'll get bailed out if things don't work out. Go ahead and make dumb decisions. Go ahead and invest and be corrupt and do all these things because the people, they'll pay for you. They'll bail you out. What other precedent has been set? Now, who owns big industries? Who owns the car industry? Who owns the banking industry? The government does, okay? When the government owns that, that is the foundation block of socialism, and the government owns the industries in the country. Okay, so the last one, you can't spend more than you earn. We could do a whole list of things here, but let's just focus on some of the latest rhetoric, okay? I find it fascinating. The debt ceiling increase. Oh, no. That's the fiscal cliff. Oh, no, that's sequestration. Oh, no, that's the government shutdown. What are they going to call it next? It's all the same thing. It's government out of control spending. And we have to name it something so that we can call it. Because what if every 2 months they called it the same thing? Government spending too much, government spending too much, government spending too much, government spending too much. We'd catch on, wouldn't we? And say, wait a second, government spending too much. But instead they call it all these different things and make it look all complex. It's not complex. Government's spending more than they earn. Do we have a problem with that? Yes. Is it perpetual? Yes. Are we fixing it? Oh, no. No. And what happens when we have these compromises? What are the compromises? They're not compromises. They're full bore, simply kicking the can down the road, right? Saying, oh, we're not gonna deal with this now. We have to spend money. We don't have any other choice. That's what we do in government. We spend money, don't we? Wait a second. If the people have to manage their budget and have to tighten their belt, then the government should have to manage their budget and tighten their belt. How would they do that? Where would we start? How would we start with the Constitution, right? Remember, 80% of what's spent in the federal government is spent unconstitutionally. Let's start there. That'd be a great way to tighten the belt, wouldn't it? So as to not depress you, the real question we need to address is, what can we do? I hope it's clear, and I hope I've said this over and over, and I hope it rings in your ears. What we need to do is we need to get back to the Constitution. That's what we need to do. Get back to the Constitution. It has the solutions. Well, what does it tell us about the economy? What does it tell us about contracts and bankruptcy and commerce and all these different things? It has the answer. So what we simply need to do is turn back to the Constitution, understand the true principles, okay? Educate ourselves. Share information with others, take action in order to take our country back and to take our economy back, put it back on sound principles of freedom, those principles that are found in the Constitution.